Hi, everybody. This is lecture 12, and even though the module is future ethics, I'm going to let what your textbook has given you and addresses as stands. So I'm not really going to add anything in addition to that. What I want to do is offer you a little bit of a notion on like how do we move forward in discussing all this stuff. So this is still philosophical, but not really pretending to that aspect of the course. So this is about our narratives and our subjectivity and what those things exactly mean. And this follows an article by Finne called The Tyranny of the Subjective, which I've linked in your course module. So I suggest you take a look at it. Okay. Anyway, when we talk about a narrative, we know narratives are stories, but this is not really just a chronological story. So if you and I have narratives, this isn't about when we were born, where we grew up, where we went to college, who we got married to, children, and so on and so on, what we do for a living. Those things become part of it, but this is more about who we are as individuals and perhaps who we are as a culture. So we can almost understand this in terms of an ethos or a mythos, like a story about who we are as individuals and also communities. And what's important about knowing that is that these particular narratives get tied into our identities. So that's important. The reality is this: if they encapsulate who we are in a story, and anybody threatens that narrative, we immediately are going to realize that as a threat to ourselves as individuals and persons. Now, that's okay in a certain way, because if we identify very closely to these narratives and those narratives get threatened or jeopardized in some way, you could see how then our identity is. But we also have to understand that we have to be able to have discussions about things that conflict with our narratives without immediately reacting and coming back to a personal mode where we feel the person is attacking us as individuals. So we have to find a balance there somehow. Okay. So anyway, the other thing with these stories is they don't necessarily need to be based on fact. A lot of times people have misconceptions about their own narratives. This is kind of an aside, so I don't want to make much of it, but you watch on TV those commercials on DNA where you go and you get, well, you offer your blood sample or whatever, and then they tell you what your ethnic background is or countries of origin and stuff. And sometimes people are surprised. Oh, here we thought we were Scottish, and I had to trade the bagpipes in for lederhosen because now I'm German. So there's something there to like who we are and what our story is that we identify with. That seems pretty reasonable. Okay. So anyway, what's important for us to know about these narratives is they become the lens by which we make judgments. So there are perspectives. So it's very important for us to know what these are, and also be very careful that we simply don't stay just within our narratives. Remember, a lot of the discussions that we have and a lot of the growth that we do as human beings happens in the periphery. So that doesn't mean that somebody who's opposed to you is going to simply change your mind and then you agree with their overall position. But they could, in one sense, awaken something that was within your own narrative that you were somewhat unaware of. You see this in various traditions. I'll leave it there. I hope that's not too vague. Okay. So anyway, the difference between some of these judgments that we make then are going to be in two basic camps: subjective and objective, right? So with a subjective experience, we're really going to use our emotions and our feelings to make judgments on particular things. Now, this does not discount the role of our emotions and passions in the world, but we have to be very careful that we're not making decisions simply based on our emotions and our passions. There's a lot of issues that are going to surround that. An objective position, rather, is going to be based on some verifiable truths or facts. And even, facts, like we think in our political sphere, we hear all the time, well, this happened and this is true about this politician. And later we find out that was necessarily true. So even those are difficult to ascertain sometimes when we make judgments, but nonetheless, something that's verifiable at least is going to be something that's going to be easily shared in common amongst those people that are outside our narratives, or within the narratives too. So we have to keep that in mind as we move along here. Now, oftentimes the problem with subjective judgments and people who, will base their decisions on a lot of these issues that we talked about that we have to concede are hot button issues within our culture. The problem is that, these emotions and feelings that we have, they're not easily shared or what we would call exportable to other people. In other words, even if we think that we are in the same narrative group, are we positive that that person, how they experience it and we experience it, is the same way? It's hard for us to know that we're sharing those that way. Another dangerous part of this is it makes us very easy to be herded, herded, right? So, if it's just a matter of, plucking our emotions to get us to be motivated to make judgments in particular ways, we could be easily maneuvered, I guess is what we should say about that, right? And two, our emotions and opinions change over time, not based on facts or verifiable truths. So they're not going to be entirely reliable. All right. Uh, you'll see a lot of this, not just in the political sphere, but in many other cultural aspects, the use of slogans. So I've said before, the problem with slogans is, that they are accepted as arguments, and they are not. So when we follow these movements, it doesn't matter if they're good or bad movements. It could be pro-life, it could be Me Too. We have to be very careful that, just because there's an aspect that we participate in that as we see as truth, that other people in that group may not share that exact understanding of it as we do. And that's if we have an emotional attachment to that. If there are some fundamental goals that are part of those movements, and then we have made decisions to follow, be part of the movements based on those, that's a different story. Okay. So anyway, just keep that, in mind, that we don't just have, sometimes movements, give us all the appearance of unity, and there's really not the unity that is necessary to make a change. Okay. So in the article, Finn's article, there's a Latin phrase, audium, alteram, partem. This means, listen to the other side. And this is not just like listening in a sense, it's not just hearing, it is listening. And the author points this out because, how was it said in the article? We have an increasingly an emotional interpretation of reality here in this second decade of the new millennium. The only way to get over this emotional interpretation of reality is to start to be in dialogue with another person, another group, another culture, and people outside of our particular narrative, right? So in the article, it talks about To Kill a Mockingbird. You may have read it with Atticus Finch, and it was very, so there was one narrative with the white female, if I remember the story right, and then the black man, and and Atticus Finch's point was we have to have both sides that are heard, listened to that way. All right. So it's also important for us to understand that when we listen to the opposing points of view, whatever that might be, political, cultural, religious, right? Just because you're listening does not mean you're agreeing. All you're doing is entering into dialogue with those. And that's very important. You're not going to be able to do philosophy. You're not going to be able to be an ethical person if you can't simply get into the other person's skin a little bit and listen to what's going on in their life, right? So just because something, let's say, we can't discard words, we should discard words such as opposition. That's probably not the best way to look at it, right? So rather than, you oppose me or I oppose you, and we're going to try to find some compromise, why don't we look at it as we both have strong opinions and they're based somewhat on fact, but we are going to come together in dialogue and hope to come to a truth. And that truth may not necessarily change our base positions, but it's going to help us nuance our arguments and our understanding. And at the very least, it's going to show respect for the other person, right? In a classroom setting in academia, this has to happen. If we're having problems doing this in academia, then how could we expect this to happen out in the public sphere, right? We have to keep that in mind. Anyway, let's see. Oh, all right. Social media is making this very difficult. So this isn't about bashing social media, but the reality is that that's very easy for us to feel connected. We can have a social media face, if you want to say that. Like, in other words, people's profiles on Facebook and the way that they post things on Facebook doesn't encapsulate who they are as individuals. So we may like that person, right? But we only like the Facebook person. Being an individual in the world is going to be quite different. So social media doesn't always connect to who we are as individuals, and it's also very difficult for us to express who we are. You can't just do it in a limited amount of words, and you can't just do it that when you're not in simple dialogue with somebody. It's almost like, sometimes, as you know, with hashtag justice, which the article talks about, it can almost be like a drive-by remark. You just throw this up there, and you just kind of like meant to throw a spear out there, and it doesn't really involve any of us in conversation, and that's not good, right? So we have to watch this. This is just, a little paragraph that I've often used in a lot of the courses that I teach. We have to make sure that the veracity of our arguments, the truth of our arguments, depends on verifiable information and facts, and not simply on the level of outrage, right? Just because somebody's angry about something and passionate about something, as good as that is, that doesn't make what they're saying true. So we have to watch that, right? Just because you formed this through opinions and feelings does not vindicate your position. All it does is it just reinforces people who are already in your closed-in narrative. So you're only speaking to your own people. And, you could think of like a political conference where, are Democrat or Republicans up there talking about something that might be an issue that they always agree with, and everybody's cheering. Well, that is not really something that we need out in the public sphere. And if all these things are simply based on our feelings and our emotions, then you're going to have, as what the article title suggests, a tyranny in the subjective. So we have to watch that, right? Let's see. Oh, all right. Oftentimes when we're in discussion about the issues that we've spoken about, abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, LGBT, environmental ethics and such, right? People in power might try to shut down our conversation. You might find that, and I hope you don't, with a particular professor or maybe a teacher that you had in high school. The fact that you're opposing something that they believe, they grade it more critically or perhaps even much lower than you deserve simply because you disagree with them. That's a problem. People in power often use, their own ideologies to enforce, how do you want to say, to further enforce and further their particular understanding of the world. We have to make sure that's not us. We could cry out when that happens to us, but we can only really have control over not doing that with other people, right? In the end, as the article says, we need to recommit ourselves to the values which enable us to coexist as communities. So it talks about these meta values, things that were always important to us. And one of them is listening to the other side. One is, let's wait for evidence before we make judgments. One, let's do our best to search out facts. I mean, these are things that allow us to coexist as people. And we're not in a political sphere or a cultural sphere where this is happening. There's a lot of movements that are going on that we're having a difficult time to talk about. And they're good movements. That doesn't discount them just because people within the movements and those who are driving the narratives aren't really doing so based on facts and verifiable truths. So win back. So if you're part of a Me Too movement, that's good. Make sure that you're working very hard and diligently, to bring justice to those people who have using their power and their prestige and their influences to, get unwanted sexual advances towards people that lack power in those situations. But let's make sure that these things are verifiable so that, I know it sounds trite, but, a few apples can spoil the whole bunch. So we have to make sure that we're working hard to make our verifiable truths and how do you want to say, our verifiable truths are not accepted as opinion. That's not really probably the best way to say it, but we're not using our opinions and pushing them off as verifiable truth. Just keep that in mind, right? We don't want to be tyrannized by each other's subjective judgments. That's the bottom line for this, right? So let's do our best to overcome hashtag justice, right? So justice, and we're always concerned about justice and virtue, it's a function of objectivity and facts, not subjectivity and opinions. That's very important, right? And the very least that's going to happen when we engage others in conversation, even those we vehemently disagree with, is it's going to broaden our own narrative. And it's also going to help us discern truth. All right? All right, guys. Have a good one.